Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we've got two military stories that should be on your radar. And trust me, they're getting a lot of attention. First story, the United States just made a bulk purchase of Israel's Iron Dome air defense systems. And we're talking a serious large-scale procurement and has already deployed them to Okinawa and Guam. Officially, the Pentagon says this is to help Marine Corps units defend those islands in case of an attack. But let's be honest, we all know the subtext. The second story is even more in your face. The commander of U.S. Army Pacific, General Charles Flynn, openly admitted that the U.S. military has already pre-stocked massive quantities of weapons and ammunition, tanks, armored vehicles, missiles, you name it, the whole arsenal in 4 locations: South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, and Australia. That's 4 forward positions wrapped right around China's doorstep. The game plan is crystal clear. If something pops off near Taiwan, American troops can fly in with nothing but their uniforms, land at these pre-positioned depots, pick up their gear, and start fighting immediately. No weeks-long trans-Pacific logistics nightmare, no vulnerable supply convoys getting sunk along the way. So naturally, after these two stories hit the news, a lot of people are asking, is the United States actually gearing up to jump into a shooting war over Taiwan? If Beijing decides to move on the island, what are the real odds that American forces would directly engage? That's exactly what we're going to dig into today. Let's start with Iron Dome. Yeah, it had a flashy reputation a few years ago when it was intercepting Hamas rockets over Gaza. But let's be real, this is a purely defensive system. It's not an offensive weapon, it doesn't strike targets, it just sits there and catches incoming projectiles. Israel used it mainly to shoot down crude rockets and mortar rounds from Gaza and Lebanon. Now we're dragging it halfway around the world to the Asia Pacific, supposedly to counter Chinese cruise missiles and drones. The U.S. military knows full well that in any real conflict with China, our bases on the first island chain, Okinawa, Guam, the Philippines, would be target number 1 in the very first wave. So putting Iron Dome in Okinawa and Guam is basically just putting an umbrella over our own heads because they're terrified of getting their runways, hangars, and ammo dumps wiped out in the opening missile barrage. Make no mistake, this is a defensive band-aid, not an offensive sword. Now let's talk about that pre-positioned equipment. The Pentagon officially calls this the Warrior Readiness Plan, the U.S. Army's pre-positioned stock program, and it's clearly aimed squarely at the Taiwan Strait. They're building these massive weapon depots in South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, and Australia, wrapping around that first island chain like a noose. Think of it as 3 layers: frontline rapid response gear in the forward positions close to China, transfer hubs in the middle to move supplies around, and a rear supply base further back in Australia. 3 tiers, like a logistics highway already paved and waiting for traffic. But here's the critical point: having the hardware sitting there in warehouses doesn't mean the troops will actually come and use it. Pre-deploying equipment is both a real combat preparation and a strategic bluff. On one hand, it's meant to scare Beijing into thinking we might roll in, so they hesitate to act. On the other hand, it's meant to pump up the separatist crowd on Taiwan to make them feel like Uncle Sam has their back, so they keep pushing the envelope and creating trouble for the mainland. So what's the actual probability that U.S. forces would directly engage in a full-scale war, my judgment? And I want to emphasize this, is that a large-scale organized conventional war against the People's Liberation Army, with American divisions fighting Chinese divisions head-on, is extremely unlikely. And it boils down to 3 simple words: we can't afford it, period. Look at the numbers, and I want you to really sit with these figures. The U.S. Think Tank Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, ran dozens of detailed war games, and most of their scenarios concluded that if the U.S. military intervenes, within 1 week we would lose at least 2 aircraft carriers. That's 2 nuclear-powered supercarriers with thousands of sailors each gone to the bottom. They also projected tens of thousands of American casualties, killed and wounded, and our forward bases across the Western Pacific would be reduced to rubble. And that's the relatively optimistic projection, the one that assumes things go reasonably well. Brown University went even further with their research. They concluded that if China and the United States go head-to-head, the war could drag on for several years with American dead and wounded in the hundreds of thousands. Think about that number. Hundreds of thousands of American sons and daughters. That kind of cost is simply unacceptable to the American public, to Congress, and to our long-term strategic interests. We are not going to sacrifice that many lives for a tiny island 9,000 miles away. And let's not forget the tactical reality: getting close to China is a suicidal nightmare. Our entire military doctrine for overseas power projection revolves around carrier strike groups. That's our bread and butter. But the PLA has built a dedicated anti-accessoria denial system specifically designed to kill our carriers. The DF-21D and DF-26 ballistic missiles were literally designed from the ground up to destroy large naval targets, and their range covers the second island chain, which means they can reach out thousands of miles. If a U.S. carrier group dares to sail openly near Taiwan, they're basically sailing into a kill box. They would be offering themselves up as targets. And on D-Day, when the shooting actually starts, the PLA's very first missile wave would target every single airfield, naval port, radar station, and communication hub on the first island chain, Okinawa, Guam, the Philippines, all of it. That means U.S. forces would have nowhere to land, no place to refuel, no place to rearm. Wednesday be left with nowhere to even park our planes. Plus, let's be brutally honest. We are already stretched way too thin right now. We're still bleeding huge amounts of resources into the Russia-Ukraine war, pouring billions of dollars and massive quantities of ammunition into that theater every month. And the Middle East is its usual eternal firestorm, Israel, Iran, the whole mess. That's another front eating up our attention, our munitions, and our troops. That's two active fronts already. If we open a third front in the Western Pacific against China, a nuclear-armed peer competitor, our defense industrial base simply cannot keep up. We don't have the factory lines, we don't have the ammunition stockpiles, and we don't have the shipyards to sustain three major conflicts at the same time. And here's the elephant in the room that nobody in Washington wants to say out loud. Neither nuclear power can afford a direct war. The United States and China both have enough nukes to annihilate each other many times over. Once a conventional fight gets hot enough and desperate enough, nobody can guarantee that it won't escalate to the nuclear level. That's a risk no American president would ever take, and any commander-in-chief who even considers it needs to have their head examined. But here's the tricky part. Not sending in ground troops doesn't mean we stay completely out of it. The United States would almost certainly step in indirectly. In all sorts of other ways, we would provide real-time intelligence and surveillance data to Taiwan. We would keep the weapons and ammunition flowing in, as long as we can get them through the blockade. We would conduct electronic warfare support, jamming Chinese communications and radar. And you can bet we'd probably send in private military contractors, mercenaries, and military advisors to train the Taiwanese forces and help them coordinate their defenses. At the same time, we would lean on our allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, the UK, and others, to slap crippling economic sanctions on China. This is the exact playbook we already perfected in Ukraine. Fight by proxy, bleed the opponent, but keep our own boys out of the trenches. But here's where the analogy completely falls apart. Taiwan is not Ukraine, and that's a critical difference that everyone needs to understand. First, geography is night and day. Ukraine is over 600,000 square kilometers. It's a massive country, roughly the size of Texas. And it shares land borders with NATO members like Poland, Romania, and Slovakia. That means Western weapons, ammunition, fuel, and supplies can pour in overland 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and Russia simply cannot stop all of it. Taiwan is only about 36,000 square kilometers, tiny, about the size of Maryland, and it's surrounded by water on all sides. Once the PLA locks down the sea and air with their Navy and Air Force, and they absolutely have the capability to do that, then Taiwan becomes a trapped rat in a cage. No supplies get in by ship, no supplies get in by plane. Every missile fired, every bullet shot, every tank destroyed is gone forever. With no replacement, the island would slowly bleed to death. Second, military scale and strategic depth aren't even in the same universe. Ukraine inherited a huge chunk of the old Soviet arsenal. We're talking thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of artillery pieces, hundreds of thousands of small arms, plus massive stockpiles of ammunition and extensive Soviet-era fortifications, bunkers, and defensive lines. That's why they've managed to hold on for years against Russia. But Taiwan, its military is relatively small. Most of its advanced equipment is bought off the shelf from the United States and other foreign suppliers. And they don't have the domestic industrial base to manufacture their own heavy weapons in wartime. Worse, the entire island sits within easy range of PLA rocket artillery, short-range ballistic missiles, and long-range cruise missiles. Every single airport, every naval port, every radar installation. All of it would be paralyzed or destroyed in the very first wave. There is no place to retreat to, no mountains to hide behind, no strategic depth to trade space for time. You can't pull back to the interior because there is no interior. Third, and this is the uncomfortable one that nobody in Taiwan wants to talk about. Combat will is a huge question mark. Ukraine is fighting a defensive war for national survival against an obvious invader. And a lot of Ukrainian citizens have actually volunteered to pick up rifles and fight to the death. That's not an easy thing to replicate in Taiwan. Sure, you've got a lot of loud voices on social media chanting independence slogans. But how many of those people are actually willing to put on a uniform, grab a rifle, and die in a trench? How many are willing to see their cities reduced to rubble? Once the first wave of missiles hits, once the first landing craft approaches the beach, a lot of those brave keyboard warriors are going to disappear into the woodwork real fast. My guess, the resistance would collapse far quicker than people expect. So the idea of turning Taiwan into Ukraine 2.0 exists only in PowerPoint presentations and think tank fantasy scenarios. The operational reality is that a Taiwan Strait conflict would move at lightning speed way faster than Ukraine. It would be a naval air blitzkrieg, probably decided in weeks, not years. By the time American aid packages are approved by Congress, by the time ships are loaded and sailed across the Pacific, by the time we figure out how to break through the PLA blockade, the whole thing might already be over. That's the cold, hard truth. Now let's talk about Japan, because a lot of people have the wrong idea here. Many folks assume Japan is just being dragged along by the United States, that Tokyo is a reluctant passenger on the American war train. But that's not the full picture at all. Japan has its own independent agenda and its own calculations. They're not just passive cannon fodder, they actually want to hitch a ride on this crisis train for years. Japan has been trying to break out of the constraints of its pacifist post-World War II constitution. They want to expand their military, develop counterstrike capabilities, and turn the self-defense forces into a real offensive-capable military. A Taiwan crisis gives them the absolute perfect excuse. Washington needs Japan's forward bases, airfields, and ports to project power against China. And Tokyo needs Washington to help loosen the leash and give them political cover to rearm. It's a mutual exploitation, each side using the other for its own ends. So what would Japan actually do if the shooting starts? First, they would almost certainly open their airfields, naval ports, and radar stations to U.S. forces for combat operations. That's a given. Second, they would provide intelligence, logistics, fuel, medical support, and maintenance, all the back-end stuff that keeps a war machine running. Third, they might conduct some limited military moves, like sending their Aegis destroyers to patrol the surrounding waters or intercepting stray missiles that wander into their airspace. Fourth, they would use the China threat narrative to dramatically boost their defense budget and accelerate the development of offensive weapons like long-range cruise missiles and hypersonic glide vehicles. But Japan also has a red line that they absolutely will not cross. As noisy as they are right now in official statements, they are not going to jump headfirst into a full-blown war against China. Why? Because they know with absolute certainty that U.S. military bases on Japanese soil and even major civilian cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya are well within the range of Chinese ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. If Japan becomes an active combatant, those cities become legitimate military targets. Japan is not stupid enough to turn itself into a smoking barbecue pit just for America's sake. Their role is to be a forward springboard and to use this crisis to rearm themselves into a normal military nation. They want the benefits without the burns. As for being cannon fodder on the front lines, they're way too clever for that. They'll let the Americans do the bleeding. Now, I'm not saying the United States won't do some risky, aggressive moves short of full-scale war. We might send a carrier strike group to the waters east of Taiwan for a show of force. We might fly surveillance drones and reconnaissance aircraft around the island around the clock. We might slip in special forces teams in small numbers to coordinate resistance. We might launch Tomahawk cruise missiles against peripheral targets inside Chinese territory, maybe against radar sites or coastal defense positions. But all of these moves come with one ironclad condition. They absolutely cannot directly trigger a full-scale U.S.-China war. Washington will dance right up to the line, push the envelope, and do everything they can to intimidate Beijing, but they will not cross that line with both feet, because the consequences would be catastrophic. At the end of the day, America's ideal play is to cause maximum trouble for China at minimum cost to ourselves. Pre-positioning weapons in allied countries, deploying Iron Dome batteries, running joint military drills with Japan and the Philippines, selling advanced weapons to Taiwan, sending naval ships through the Taiwan Strait. All of it serves three core goals. First, deter China from acting by keeping the credible threat of American intervention alive in Beijing's calculations. Second, arm Taiwan and pump up their confidence so the separatist elements feel emboldened, hoping they can provoke China into a costly war of attrition. Third, lock in our allies, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, into a unified containment ring around China so that everyone has skin in the game. But here's the bottom line that every American needs to understand. Washington absolutely knows, that Taiwan is China's absolute red line. It's not a peripheral issue, it's the single most sensitive issue in Beijing's foreign policy. For China, Taiwan is about national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and a century of humiliation that they have never forgotten. But to the United States, Taiwan is just a chess piece, a very useful one, yes, but still a pawn on a much larger board. So America will never ever sacrifice its own blood and treasure for Taiwan's sake. We will not die for Taipei, but we will absolutely use Taiwan to bleed China, slow them down, drain their resources, and complicate their rise. That's the name of the game, containment without suicide. So let's be really clear about what we mean by intervention. If we're talking about a Korean War style, massive full frontal commitment, American divisions fighting Chinese divisions, carrier groups exchanging fire with the LA Navy, air-to-air combat over the strait, that probability is so low it's essentially zero. The cost is astronomical, the risk is existential, and it flat out does not serve American interests in any way whatsoever. But if we're talking about intelligence sharing, weapons sales, military advisors, electronic warfare, standoff naval patrols, and economic sanctions, then that probability is extremely high, almost certain, because it's cheap, it's effective, and it's exactly the kind of asymmetric, risk-free warfare we excel at. But here's the kicker, and I want you to remember this. Whether the United States intervenes, and to what degree, has never been the decisive factor in the Taiwan Strait. It never has been, and it never will be. Whether Taiwan ends up being unified with the mainland, peacefully or otherwise, depends entirely on Beijing's own capabilities, their military readiness, their economic strength, and most importantly, their political will and resolve. You can throw all the bluster, all the carrier groups, all the Iron Dome batteries, all the pre-positioned ammunition in the world at this problem. But when Beijing decides they are truly ready militarily, economically, and politically, then it won't matter whether we show up or not. The outcome will already be written. The United States can influence the timeline. We can complicate the operation. We can raise the price, but we cannot change the ultimate outcome if China is determined to see it through. And one more thing, because I know people will ask about the 3 no's and all the official positions. None of that changes the fundamental strategic calculus. China has been crystal clear for decades. Taiwan is a core interest, and they are prepared to pay an enormous price to achieve reunification. The United States has never made that kind of commitment to Taiwan. Our commitment has always been ambiguous, studiedly vague, and deliberately hedged. That asymmetry tells you everything you need to know about who really holds the cards here. So when you see headlines about U.S. military moves, when you read about Iron Dome deployments or weapons stockpiles in Japan, just remember the context. This is posturing, this is deterrence, this is preparation, but it is not a suicide pact. We are preparing for every contingency, as any professional military should, but that doesn't mean we're actually looking to start World War III over a small island 9,000 miles from California. The American people would never support that, Congress would never authorize that, and no president would ever take that risk unless they were absolutely cornered. All right? I know that's a lot to digest, but I wanted to give you the full picture without leaving anything out. This is a complex issue with huge implications, and you deserve to understand all the moving parts. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the US would actually go to war over Taiwan? Or is this all just geopolitical bluffing? And if you think we should be more aggressive in backing Taiwan or less aggressive, drop a comment and tell me why. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay sharp, stay informed, and don't let the headlines fool you later.